Be ambitious because you only get one chance to decide on the mission that you want to go on. And so just be very deliberate about what you start, because once you start it, there's no turning back, and you're going to be on that journey for a while.
Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to the Deal Maker Show. So today we have an amazing guest joining us. We're going to be talking about all the good stuff that we like to hear when it comes to building, scaling, and also exiting. His last company was quite a success, one of those 10x, and more, for some other investors. But we're going to be hearing all the ins and outs. We're going to be talking about what happened, when he went to the Navy, some of the other stuff like raising money, as well as how to create a vessel, that is autonomous, that goes on its own up in the ocean. So again, brace yourself for quite the inspiring conversation. And without further ado, let's welcome our guest today, Rylan Hamilton. Welcome to the show.
All right, thanks for having me.
So originally born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. So give us a walk through memory lane. How was life growing up for you?
I loved growing up in Boston. I actually grew up right next to the Freedom Trail, but I never really did the whole Freedom Trail sort of from start to finish. But it's a great city, great universities, and what I love about the city, and I know you're from around the greater New York City area, but we have people who work at universities, people who work in technology, we have doctors. It was a great environment to grow up in.
Now, I know that for you, you ended up going to Harvard. And one of the good things there is that you were able to experience and test things out. I mean, one of them, for example, even working, in finance, you also got a taste of startups too. So tell us, what were you testing there when it comes to more of the career, side of things, and what kind of sparked, that decision on what would be the path to follow, after that?
Yeah, if I go back to the 20-year-old Rylan at Harvard, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. The most common jobs back then were either being in consulting or being in some type of finance role. And so I actually had the opportunity to have an internship in finance in New York City. And I surrounded myself with amazing people. I learned a ton, but I realized after that summer that it just wasn't really the calling for me. I wasn't kind of designed to be behind a computer from 9 to 5 or even for much longer hours doing spreadsheets all day long. And actually, a couple of weeks after I left that job in New York City, 9/11 happened. And I actually worked in an office that was looking at the World Trade Center, the towers that were there. And so at that moment, it kind of really shook me up. And I said, there's got to be something else that I want to do with my life. And a year later, I ended up joining the Navy.
Obviously, you had it in the family too. Your father was in the Navy. Your grandfather was too. So tell us, how was that experience for you? I mean, that sounds quite like the forming, experience, no? And probably crazy stuff that you experienced.
It definitely was one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life, but it wasn't obvious at the time. So as you mentioned, my grandfather served in the Pacific. My father actually went to the Naval Academy and was on nuclear submarines in the 60s, but he passed away when I was younger. So I didn't kind of grow up with that kind of legacy around sort of the dining room table. And my adoptive father at the time, when I told him I was considering kind of joining the Navy, he's like, it just didn't make sense to him. He's like, you're at Harvard right now? Like, no one from Harvard joins the Navy. And I said, well, why do you think it's a bad idea? Or what are you thinking? He's like, well, why don't you talk to all my friends who are in the Navy and they can give you some career advice. And so I talked to all his friends who'd been in the Navy and they all said, like, join the Navy. It'll be the best decision you ever do. So I kind of jumped into that decision, but I had an amazing experience. And so I found myself going from school in Boston, Massachusetts to 6 months later, I was at Officer Candidate School in Pensacola, Florida with a shaved head and trying to figure out, what this whole experience would be like.
And obviously going around the world too. So how was that experience of being deployed in some of those areas that were not as pleasant, to be in, with all types of crazy stuff around you?
It was. So the first ship that I was on was an amphibious transport ship. And I just finished, as I mentioned, Officer Candidate School in Pensacola, Florida. And I flew out to meet the ship in the Persian Gulf. And it was just before we invaded Iraq at the time. And it was called Operation Iraqi Freedom. And so here I was on a ship, and the ship was offloading Marines and all their equipment, and then it moved into doing some minesweeping. And this was like my experience for the first couple of weeks of being on a real Navy ship. And I was just basically drinking from the fire hose, trying to learn how to do this job. In fact, the first day that I was on a ship in the Persian Gulf, the Iranians actually fired some missiles, and the whole ship went to general quarters. And so at that time, because I just had flown in on a helicopter to the ship, I was still in my civilian kind of garment or clothing, and I was basically running around the ship. And an officer grabbed me and said, he said, "Ensign Hamilton, it doesn't look like you know what you're doing." He grabbed me and pulled me into a room. And that was like my first kind of experience of being in the Navy. But started off in the Persian Gulf, had an experience to go through the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and then I ended my naval career being in the Eastern Pacific doing counter-narco-terrorism operations on a frigate.
I remember the reading the book Extreme Ownership. I
Yeah.
don't know if you've had the chance to read it, but it's a phenomenal book. I guess one thing that comes to mind now is, what do you think that experience gave you in terms of like the top three things that you apply on the way that you approach life and perhaps business?
Yeah. So ownership is definitely one of them. When you're on a ship or when you're in the military, you can't just necessarily take no for an answer, or if something doesn't work, say, I guess it doesn't work. Like, you're literally on a ship with your shipmates in the middle of the ocean, and you just have to make sure everything works, that the whole team kind of operates cohesively. So ownership's one. The second is leading from the front. You have to be willing to do the job and kind of show people that you're willing to do whatever it takes. You can roll up your sleeves, you can work the long hours, because if you're not willing to do that work, why would anyone who's working for you be willing to do that? And then the third thing, what I really appreciate from the Navy is, and it's kind of like being at a startup, I'd call it this boardroom mentality, where when you're in the Navy, everyone, like, what everyone makes. Like, literally your salary is posted on the wall. So it's not about getting promoted. It's not about a bonus or anything. It's just like, we're all in this room together. How do we make this work? And what's the mission that's important? And so it really removes a lot of the politics and kind of other layers of bureaucracy that you get in bigger companies. And I feel like you have the same sense of camaraderie when you're at a startup. It's like, we're all in this room, titles don't matter. And like, what does it take to make this work? Whereas, sometimes if you work at a big company and people are really kind of, they care about their promotion, they care about the titles, they care about stuff that's really not as important to the mission.
So then you got out of the Navy, and then you married your college sweetheart, and then you went at it. No, on the professional side of things, with you started working at Kiva Systems, which was also quite pivotal for you, because the company ended up getting acquired. Then you launched your first company, which was a smashing exit to a smashing success. I guess, how was that experience too with Kiva Systems? Like, what were you doing? Why did you land there? And it sounds like, even though you were employee 200, it was already a rocket ship, and you were able to get a glimpse of what the good stuff, looks like.
Yeah. So actually, just before Kiva Systems, I worked briefly at a company called Vistaprint, and they were a global leader actually in making marketing material for small businesses, including business cards. And so when I started interviewing at Kiva Systems, I was like, this is so cool. We're making mobile robots for warehouse automation. I was like, business cards, like, very like good business, but robots are a lot cooler. And so I snuck my way into Kiva Systems. They gave me a job, but I had no background in robotics or supply chain. But I just started at the kind of, the warehouse floor and worked my way up. And as you mentioned, it was a rocket ship by that point. They had a very disruptive technology. E-commerce was taking off. Companies like Toys R Us and Dillard's, and Office Depot were basically buying these systems to help kind of fulfill online orders. But while it was a rocket ship, the technology wasn't yet scalable. And so there were definitely a lot of like, just, the company at that time, basically all the successful kind of deployments were based on heroics. And we had to shift from being like heroics and people working 100 hours plus per week to something that was more scalable. And within 2 years, the company was bought by Amazon, which at the time, I think had like a market capitalization of like $40 billion.
I mean, 775 million. That's quite an exit for everyone on the team. Now,
Yeah.
right after this, you decided to go at it and to finally take ownership of your destiny, of your future, become an entrepreneur. I mean, that's quite a transition, coming out of a company like that with Kiva Systems. So, what do you think needed to happen for you to decide to be like, hey, it's my time to become an entrepreneur now?
Yeah. Well, I know there are other entrepreneurs listening to your podcast, but at that time, I actually wasn't looking to start a company, but I started talking to some other robotics companies, and a lot of them actually were in the Boston area. And Boston has become kind of like this hub for consumer and industrial robotics. But I realized at the time that, the technology that was being used for autonomous vehicles, so the sensors, the GPUs, and some of the same open source software could also be used for warehouse robotics. And that, if you look at a technology like Kiva systems, the robots followed stickers on the ground. They were behind machine guarding, but you could actually transition to where you could basically release the robots from the cage and they'd be collaborative and they could do some of the same jobs as the Kiva robots do, but at a much lower price point. And so I just had this moment with one of my other co-founders, said, you know what, we'll kick ourselves if we don't start this company now. In 5 years, we'll just really regret it. And so it's just one of those moments where you said, like, now's the time. And we were all willing to make kind of a bet and basically take a year with minimal salary to see if we'd get the company off the ground.
So what ended up becoming the business model for the company, for Six River Systems?
Yeah, so we basically either sold or leased robotic systems to help automate e-commerce warehouses. And we had customers like XPO who really kind of adopted en masse. And we sold the company 4 years later to Shopify for $450 million. So we raised 45, we sold it for 450. So it was a great kind of exit for investors, for employees. But I think the thing I'm most proud about is that technology is now used in over 100 warehouses all throughout the world. And we were one of the leading companies where, if you look at the total amount of collaborative autonomous mobile robots that are out there, there's tens of thousands of robots all throughout the world. So it's one of the kind of mainstream ways of automating a warehouse today.
And you talked about the exit, you talked about the amount raised, but I know that raising those $45 million was not an easy journey and an easy path to go through. So what do you think, was so hard about, raising money with this company and yeah, walk us through what were the financing cycles there that you guys had to endure?
Yeah. So I think there are two things. First, anytime you start a company and you're doing the hardware and the software, it's always hard to raise money. It takes a lot more capital to kind of get early indications of product market fit, especially in robotics where it's a very complicated problem. And then the second is finding investors with a conviction that believe in what you're doing, that understand the competition, because then, again, it takes capital to kind of get to a point where you can kind of start to scale with your customers. And so for those first couple of years, it just wasn't easy raising money. We had some great investors and people who had conviction, but I think some founders are out there and you hear the stories and they have dozens of term sheets in front of them and all that, but it was never the case for us. We always had a couple of term sheets, but it felt like we really had to kind of work hard to kind of like raise money and kind of, but what that did is that, made us internalize how hard it was to kind of raise money, how hard it was to build a company. And we were very thoughtful about all the dollars that we spent. And in some ways, we're pretty scrappy. So the first kind of deployment engineers for the company, when we had our first versions of our robots, were the two co-founders, myself and Jerome. Instead of hiring office managers, instead of hiring engineers we basically found ourselves driving, 4 hours each way to our first deployment in Pennsylvania from Boston. And we said, we're just going to be really mindful about our capital raise and our resources. And we're going to do all the kind of early work for getting these systems up and running versus trying to hire people to do those jobs. And so I think that allowed us to be very capital efficient. So we didn't raise, a lot of money relative to kind of what we were able to exit with. But I feel like sometimes if you look at some of the current kind of robotics companies that are out there, they're raising tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars out of the gate. And I think sometimes there's a danger there about raising too much money too quickly because you kind of lose that kind of scrappy mentality.
So let's talk about the exit. Let's talk about the exit because a lot of founders are listening now, and I'm sure that there's a lot of good information that they can really get inspired by and learn. Because a lot of people, and you read a lot on raising money, and this company raised that, this company raised that, but the exit, really the final moment of really coming together on the life cycle of a business. I think that's a critical part. It's all about, obviously the journey, but the finish line is ultimately what you're optimizing for to get the best possible outcome for everyone. Make us insiders. How was that acquisition? That was obviously the buyer there was Shopify, and you mentioned it, 450 million.
Yeah.
Make us insiders. How did that happen? How did that come together?
So we actually really didn't know much about Shopify about 12 months before we sold the company. We weren't looking to sell the company. What we knew internally is we didn't want to necessarily sell our company to a traditional automation provider, to a company that historically had deployed, automation like conveyors that were out there, because they weren't really innovative. We thought it would kind of stifle our ambitions. So we always thought we'd take the company public. We were raising a Series C at the time. We actually had a term sheet from a Series C in our hands. So I think at the time it was about $50 million Series C. And we met this company called Shopify. And Shopify at the time, and so Shopify is basically, a company out of Canada. It's Amazon's kind of biggest competition that's out there. They have a different model, obviously, to Amazon, but they power, most of the websites out of Amazon that basically allow merchants to sell things online. And at the time, Shopify was launching something called Shopify Logistics. And we started jamming with them. And we talked about maybe potentially selling some of our automation solutions to Shopify so they could use internally in their warehouses. The conversations were going so well that they really wanted to pull us into their strategic roadmap. But we said, look, we have like 20 other customers that are out there. We can't prioritize you, even if you buy hundreds of robots over all of our other customers. But we really like their jam. And we said, look, myself and another co-founder, we'd been at Kiva Systems. We'd seen the acquisition by Amazon. And we said, we kind of had this pattern recognition. We said, if you really want to move fast with us, maybe you'd want to acquire us and we could become part of Shopify Logistics. And so I think for your listeners, it's like, this was an acquisition where we were searching for a buyer, whereas we found someone, we got pulled into this process. And because we had a Series C in hand, we actually had some leverage to kind of move the process pretty quickly. And within a couple of months, we actually, signed an LOI with Shopify, and within, I think it was about 4 months from the time we first met them to the time the deal was closed, we kind of closed that acquisition.
That's amazing. What was going through your mind the day that you were signing, the papers for $450 million?
Well, I think people don't realize that there's a series of things that you need to sign along the way. And so at first it's like, oh, you get a verbal and they might want to acquire you, and then you negotiate on the price. And then you get an LOI, and then you have to negotiate that LOI. And so it basically becomes this protracted period of whether it's months or sometimes it could be a year of having that early excitement that there could be an exit in hand, to saying you've got to basically live with yourself for the next 4 months until the deal is actually finally closed. We had a great CFO at the time. He was very fit. He was actually a college athlete. He actually lost 10 pounds over the summer while we're doing this. And it just shows the amount of stress that like you and the leadership team has to absorb to go through a process like that. So there's a huge amount of relief at the end when you kind of like finally like close the deal. But it's not like this overnight thing. It's not like the first thing that you sign like closes the deal. There's just a lot of stages that you have to go through.
But without a doubt, quite a life-changing event, man, to get a transaction of that nature. I mean, I think that our listeners would love for me to ask you, what is one thing, that you always wanted to do that you were finally able to do, once that you've achieved, that type of financial freedom?
I don't know. I bought a boat. I love being on the ocean and I love being on the water, and I bought a boat. And actually, I bought a boat during COVID, which was 2020, and it wasn't the best time for a buyer to buy a boat. But it's something that, I always wanted. I got a nice boat and I take my family out on it. So that's kind of, I know maybe it's not the answer you're looking for, but it's a little splurge that I had right after the acquisition.
I love it. I love it. Now, you could have gone on the boat, and retire and never come back. But as they say, once an entrepreneur, always an entrepreneur. And that was not the end of your entrepreneurial journey. So what happened next?
So I worked for Shopify for a couple of years. And then when I left Shopify, I kind of found myself like on the boat and trying to figure out what I want to do next. I guess I'm at the kind of part time in my career where most of my friends are not retired. And so I didn't have anyone to play golf with Monday through Friday or to kind of and so I just found like I had to keep busy. And so I just, reached out to the most interesting people that I could find in my network and started having coffees and lunches and Zoom meetings and you name it, and started to explore and try to figure out, I didn't know if I want to become an investor. I didn't know if I want to start another company. I didn't know if I want to join another company. But through that process, which was less than a year, I actually started to get the itch again to go start a company. And I met one of my other co-founders, Austin Gray, and we started this company called Blue Water Autonomy.
So then tell us about the company, Blue Water Systems. Like how did it come together? How did you guys, decide to get going here?
So it's definitely in exploration mode when I met Austin. Like me, he'd served in the Navy. and he was still in graduate school. And he actually had spent the previous summer working at a drone factory in Ukraine on the front lines. And he was taking some of the lessons from that factory and just in terms of how warfare was changing rapidly in Ukraine and applying it to kind of our Navy. And he said, look, our Navy is kind of being slow in adopting some of these autonomous systems, and especially around attritable systems that could move some of the same payloads that our manned warships today carry across the open ocean. Our Navy needs to think about platforms that could actually move those payloads across the open ocean, but without people, and do it at a much lower price point. And at the time, he was very focused on contested logistics. And the two of us started meeting once a week and just exploring and started. We talked to as many smart people as we could, people who had been in industry, people who are in the Navy currently or had just gotten out of the Navy. And we started to get really smart about the space. And where we did is our kind of idea evolved around building a purpose-built kind of autonomous ship for contested logistics to thinking about a multi-mission ship that could be, do many different things within the Navy and focusing on the key enabling technology for that. And after about 6 months, we both got the conviction to basically start the company and raise some private capital. And so that's what we did last year in 2024.
So with Blue Water Autonomy here, what would you say are like the toughest things, when it comes down to like building and putting together a vessel that are just throwing out in the ocean that needs to be on its own for months at a time?
Yeah. So we actually raised our Series A from Google Ventures, and the thing that we love about Google is one of like the leaders in autonomy. So everyone thinks about Waymo, which is one of the companies under Google or Alphabet. And so if you think about Waymo, and I've been in a couple Waymos, and I think the experience is just amazing. Everyone thinks about autonomous systems. They think about like the autonomy on the outside of the vehicle. So the sensors that can make sure that the vehicle or the ship can basically localize, it can do waypoint navigation, it can drive around other things. But when you think about an autonomous ship, the hard part is actually the autonomy on the inside of the ship. It's just, this is a ship that needs to be out there for weeks or months at a time. And it doesn't have the opportunity like a Waymo vehicle to basically go into a garage at night and be repaired, to calibrate the sensors, to do all that other work. And so when we first started this company, our focus was on like, how can you take a ship where if you take a manned ship in today's Navy, you have 50 engineers who basically are on the ship, they stand watch, they maintain, and they repair all the internal systems. How can you take those 50 people, take them off the ship, and still have it operate for months at a time? And so that's where we kind of first started the company. And today we do full stack autonomy, from everything from navigation to engineering autonomy to integrating to different payloads. But because we took this kind of non-conventional approach to solving this problem, I think we got early traction with the Navy.
Do you think that this time around it was a little bit easier to raise money?
It definitely was a lot easier to raise money this time around. I think they're, probably for two reasons. The most obvious reason is, I'm a repeat founder and I had a successful exit. And so it makes it a lot easier to get your foot in the door with investors. And I think the second thing is this opportunity is 10x bigger than my last company. If you think about, what we're doing at a very kind of basic level, we move payloads across the open ocean, and where our aim is to do it at a lower cost. In the same way that SpaceX basically launches payloads into space and has been able to do it at dramatically lower cost, we're just doing it at the surface of the ocean. And because of 80% of the world's GDP moves across the open oceans, there's just a massive opportunity. Our first customer is the Navy and the U.S. Navy. But our investors saw like a much bigger opportunity. So it's been easier to raise money. And so over the last 2 years, we've already raised over $60 million from investors like Google Ventures and Eclipse and Riot.
I love it. Now, one thing that I'm sure that there's a lot of founders listening here is market sizing, and how to think about that really when you decide to embark on a journey with launching a new business, how important it is, and how should founders think about it?
Yeah. So I think when you think about an opportunity or starting a company, you should think about where you're aiming. And you want to make sure that you aim as high as you can and you're as ambitious as you can be. Because if you're off a little, that's okay. But if you don't aim very high and then you're off a little, then it's just the market opportunity is a lot smaller and it's going to be harder to raise money. And so, and I think obviously in the early days, as you kind of ideate with your co-founders, figure out what you want to do, you're always learning. But just try to be ambitious, because you only get a couple of times to start a company. When you start a company, you also have to have this view that like you're going to be working at that company for the next 10 years. Unlike joining a company where maybe you work for 4 years, and 4 years is a good amount of time at any company. when you start a company, you don't have an opportunity just to leave and pass the baton to someone else. Like you're in it for a very long amount of time. And so you just have to be very thoughtful. And I think one of the other challenges that people have is that we're all busy with our careers. And then if you're trying to start a company while also working at another company, sometimes you don't just give yourself enough sort of mental space to think about what's the best opportunity I want to go work at. And so sometimes I think the best companies are when you leave a company or maybe you get fired or something and you find yourself kind of unemployed and you just give yourself like 6 months of exploration, because then you can pick the best opportunity for you versus just trying to jump to a startup because it sounds cool and you start working on it. So I think if, kind of synthesizing what I just said, like think about the best opportunity that you can go work on and give yourself a little bit of time. Don't just jump to the flashy thing that's in front of you that seems like a cool idea to go start.
So going back to Blue Water Autonomy, let's say you go to sleep tonight and you wake up in a world where the vision of the company is fully realized. What does that world look like?
So if I think about our first customer, which is the U.S. Navy and allied navies, we're all moving across all domains and all kind of services to basically either drone warfare or hybrid fleets. So like for our U.S. Navy, today our Navy has manned ships that kind of perform all the different missions that are important for our national security. But we're moving to a hybrid fleet where it's going to be a mix of manned and unmanned ships that are out there. And I think about plus or minus 30% of the fleet will be unmanned. And so we really want to push that vision as fast as we can. And so I hope within the next 10 years that a significant portion of our Navy will be these kind of unmanned vessels doing many different missions. And so that's the first piece. And then the second piece is like, and I think it's a bigger opportunity. I always call it like middle mile logistics would be the kind of first big opportunity where basically if you transport anything via water, the cost of transportation is like a fraction of what it costs to transport it over either the road or railway. And obviously flying things is a lot more expensive. And so the bigger vision is like, you think about all these ships that are out there, it's a boring, dangerous, and kind of dull job a lot of times, standing on a bridge or standing in an engine room, kind of watching these ships. And so there is, our vision is really to kind of like take these ships, transform them, make them software defined, and have a bunch of autonomous ships with no people operating all across the globe.
So we're talking here, from a basically forward-looking approach. I want to talk about the past, but with a lens of reflection. And let's say I'm able to put you into a time machine and I'm able to bring you back to that moment where now you're coming out of the acquisition of Kiva Systems and you're thinking about launching something of your own. But let's say you're able to show up right there with your younger self and you're able to give that younger Rylan one piece of advice for launching a business. What would that be and why, given what you know now?
I'd say be ambitious and really I actually think the company I started after Kiva Systems, Six River Systems, was a very natural company for me to go start with my other co-founders because I knew the market, I knew the customer, and I knew the technology. And being a first-time founder, it felt like something that was like definitely achievable. There's a lot of hard work and execution that went into it. I don't know if the Rylan back, right after Kiva Systems could have started Blue Water Autonomy, because when we started Six River Systems, we made mobile robots that were in the tens of thousands of dollars. Now we're making, at our current company, Blue Water Autonomy, autonomous ships that cost in the tens of millions of dollars. So it takes a lot of capital. And I think all the experiences that I've had allow me to kind of do this current company. So I'm not sure if I'd give any advice that necessarily would have changed the direction I would have gone in. But to any founder that's out there, just say, be ambitious because you only get one chance to decide on the startup, and the mission that you want to go on. And so just be very deliberate about what you start, because once you start it, there's no turning back, and you're going to be on that journey for a while.
I love that. Rylan, for the people that are listening that would love to reach out and say hi, what is the best way for them to do so?
So I'm on LinkedIn. I don't have any of those filters, so you can just request to join my professional network, and I'm on there every night. And I just love meeting people from all different types of backgrounds and learning from people.
Amazing. Well, Rylan, thank you so much for being on the Deal Maker Show. It has been an absolute honor to have you with us.
Oh, this is great. Thanks for having me.